Hello lads, lassies, and those of unspecified gender, it's the Irishman here, and today we're going to be talking about what would have happened if Invincible got his powers early. For a good long while I've been the Dragon Ball guy, and yes, I do still love the series and will probably make more videos on it in the future, but for right now I think I'm going to switch things up and move into a different media. All sorts of different shows and movies rather than focusing on just anime. The reason I'm choosing to do this video first is because another creator known as Merge Productions, who mostly makes Breaking Bad videos, is sort of doing the same thing, branching out into other sorts of media. He actually covered this very same concept earlier this week, and I'll leave his video alongside a link to his channel in the comments. Admittedly, and Merge said this himself, it is a pretty basic sort of idea, and it's actually already been answered in the show. Well, kind of. See, there are all sorts of evil Invincible variants, and most of them probably turned evil because they got their powers earlier than the main series mark. That reminds me, this is your first and last spoiler warning. If you haven't already seen the show, go and watch it right now, and don't worry, I won't spoil anything for the comics, even though I have read them. Oh, and watch Merge's video, it's amazing, and if you like this one, you're definitely going to like his. But without any further ado, let's get into the story of this What If. Mark Grayson is the son of Nolan Grayson and Debbie Grayson. One is a hero from beyond the stars, and the other is a real estate agent. Both serve their purpose, but ultimately one is a bit more inspiring to the youth. And thus, for most of Mark's life, he looked up to his father, wanting to be just like him. And he couldn't have been more happier when at the ripe old age of 10, he unlocked his powers. Well, unlock might not be the best word, since it was more of an awakening. He was out at a barbecue with his parents and his best friend William, when suddenly he didn't need to fight back against gravity anymore. While running around playing superhero with his best friend, when he jumped in the air to pretend to fly, he wasn't pretending. He didn't feel the need to come back down. There was no force compelling his legs to touch the ground again. Instead, he was just floating in the air. For a moment, William looks on terrified. Mark is flying right now, like actually flying. But at the same time, this is the coolest thing he has ever seen. The fear is replaced with intrigue when he himself tries to fly, but obviously that doesn't work. Mark would begin testing his abilities, roaming around in the air and getting used to flying. Creating his own leverage was something so foreign, it was a concept he couldn't wrap his head around, especially not at 10 years old, but it was something that he was biologically engineered to be capable of doing. Pair that alongside the fact that Nolan had told his son years ago about their alien origin, and Mark is getting used to this exceptionally fast. The only problem is, even though getting up is easy, coming back down is more difficult. He goes as high as he possibly can, into the atmosphere even, and then things take a turn for the worse. He starts suffocating, unable to breathe. The Viltrumites might have increased lung capacity, but he didn't know to take a breath before entering a space with no air. Mostly because he's 10 years old and didn't know that the outermost atmosphere didn't have air. He hasn't gotten taught that in science yet. The oxygen that he did have is almost completely gone, and before he knows it, there's almost no air going to his brain. He's cold to the touch, and even though he does start falling back down, he's still unconscious. He'd descend at rapidly increasing speeds until eventually Omni-Man would step in to help. Nolan would catch his son in a way that disperses all of the kinetic energy, leaving Mark relatively unharmed except for a couple bruises and a headache. Omni-Man would float back down to the campsite where they were having their cookout and set Mark down on a lawn chair. He would tell Debbie that their son has finally gotten their powers, to which she would reveal she already knew because William had already told her. While it was pretty obvious somebody was up in the sky, she didn't know it was her 10-year-old kid, up until William came up and said, "Hey, that's your son a couple thousand miles in the air." The Graysons would take William home, telling him to forget the entire situation and not tell anyone anything. Mark and him can still be friends, but for right now, they need to get this under control. And since Omni-Man was one of the people telling him this, yeah, William's lips are sealed. Mark would wake up the next morning and Nolan would take him out for a flying session, not only to teach him the basics, but also to have a very important conversation with him. Everything about the way that Mark got his powers made Nolan very upset, mostly because he wasn't the first person that Mark went to with it. Yes, of course, William was there when he got his powers, and Nolan isn't even upset that he knows, rather that after Mark realized he can fly and do all these incredible things, he didn't immediately come to his father with it. He's not just a kid anymore, instead Instead, he's a soldier for the Viltrum Empire, and Nolan would be way more upfront about that since, well, Mark isn't anywhere near as headstrong as an older version of himself would be. This means he's way more impressionable, and is far less likely to openly deny his father even if he's doing horrible things. It should be noted that this version of Mark does still value human life, thanks to Debbie being an active part of his life. Alongside the fact that he's grown up as a regular human for 10 years, he's not just going to outright kill people for the fun of it or because his dad said so. However, that can change, and Nolan really doesn't have a due date on this assignment, so he can continue working to groom Mark into the perfect soldier for as long as he wants. The first thing he's going to do, though, is take Mark to Art Rosenbaum, somebody who designs suits for all types of superheroes. And since right now Nolan would be raising Mark to want to be a superhero instead of just a soldier, he would get Mark his very own costume. Well, very own isn't just right, since for right now, Mark would actually be taking inspiration from his father, using the same sort of pattern as his dad's suit, except with his own colors. He would begin fighting alongside his dad against all sorts of world-ending threats, and even though his mom does still want him to go to school, it becomes less and less of a priority the older he gets. By the time he's high school age, he would actually drop out, since it's not like he needs any higher education to be a better superhero. He's already doing what he plans to for the rest of his life. And it's not like he would want to be in school either. He ages slower than everybody else. By the time he's 15, he would look 12, and he'd be a social outcast. It really doesn't help that he wouldn't be in school much either, since, well, it's more important to save the Washington Monument from being destroyed than learn about how it was built. Debbie would be upset about this, but there's not much she can do to argue it since Mark's logic is pretty sound, and this is what Nolan wants him to do. It had gotten to the point where Debbie had such little control over Mark's life and felt so disconnected from the two of them, she tried to file for divorce, and even though it went through, this didn't solve any of her problems. Wanting to keep up appearances for a little bit longer, Nolan would decide to use his connections through the GDA to give him full custody over Mark, bribing the judge to make this happen. However, if I'm being completely honest, that was more of a power move. Really, Nolan just wanted to show he had control over every facet of his own life, including his son. It's not like this really mattered in the slightest, since Nolan and Mark Grayson really weren't the problem. It was more Omni-Man and Omni-Kid that were the real issue for Debbie. She wanted to have a regular family, and one superhero she could handle. She knew her husband could take anything the world dished out, and she was used to him not being home all the time, but her kid? That was a different story. Sadly though now, Debbie is completely separate from the two, and Mark has lost his entire moral compass. Thanks to no longer being in school, he rarely ever sees William, and with his mom out of the picture, all of the human elements of his life are gone. He's cold, calculating. Anytime he's around anybody in public, he's putting up the same act that Omni-Man is. By the time of what would be his high school graduation, Mark is a full-fledged Viltrumite, although because his body has not gotten done growing, he isn't yet ready to take on the entire world full of superheroes. At least, not on his own. His first mission, once he's fully on board with conquering the planet, would be taking down the Guardians of the Globe alongside his father. Nolan would send a distress call to the Guardians, and once all of them had arrived, he would storm in, going to land a hit on the Immortal, someone he perceived to be the biggest threat thanks to his incredible strength rivaling even weaker Viltrumites. Red Rush would do as his name implies, rushing over and pushing the Immortal out of the way of Omni-Man's attack, leaving the superhero now visible to everyone else in the room, and his intentions are clear. Instantly, Red Rush would go on the offensive, running in, landing a hit on Nolan, and jumping back just as quick. This is only effective for a moment though, as eventually Nolan is able to catch one of Red Rush's hits, grabbing his wrist before putting his other hand on the speedster's head. Quickly, the first hand would move up there as well, and in a matter of seconds, which feels like hours for Red Rush, the speedster's skull would be squished like a grape. The rest of the Guardians begin freaking out, but suddenly they would realize a couple of their members aren't there. Green Ghost had been taken out while she was still in material form by Mark, who had snuck into the building while everyone was distracted. Martian Man's core organ had been crushed, leaving him as a pile of goop on the ground, and suddenly War Woman could feel a hand on the back of her neck. Pretty much everybody on Earth knew about Omni-Man and his son, the dynamic duo that rivaled even the Guardians themselves, so War Woman had a pretty good idea of who was about to take her life. She tries appealing to his human side, knowing that he's just a kid, saying he doesn't have to do this, he can make the right choice, he can be a real hero, but Mark just isn't interested. With a single motion from his wrist, he snaps her neck like it's nothing. then rushes over to Darkwing, who has no time to escape or think of some sort of backup plan. Next, he turns to Aquarius, who would shoot him with a blast of ultra-condensed water, holding him back, while Immortal tackles Omni-Man through the side of the building and out into the sky. He was bloodlusted, blinded by his own rage. He had just seen his entire team, people he had fought with for years, slaughtered in a matter of moments, so he's not holding anything back. He's able to get a couple good licks in, but ultimately Omni-Man is still too strong. The damage he did was ultimately insignificant, as Nolan would cleave his head off with a single slash of his hand, then taking the Immortal's head and crushing it into paste. Once Earth's strongest hero's immortal life was now brought to an eternal end. Back at Guardians HQ, Mark is seen standing over the dead body of Aquarius, whose water attacks didn't really do anything when they couldn't hit. Mark simply speed blitzed him and the fishy hero couldn't keep up. Thanks to the Guardians being taken down faster and easier than in the original, neither Mark nor his dad are in critical condition, and thus they're able to get right back to work. The duo would show up to the Pentagon, guns blazing, slaughtering everybody there. Thanks to Mark not having any qualms against killing his villain, Sinclair is long dead and there are no reanimen to help. The kaiju that Omni-Man fought against at the end of Season 1 would still be around, except it's nowhere near as big of a problem since Mark and Nolan are fighting together. Much like what happened during the Invincible War, every single available hero on the planet would be called to help, but none of them are able to do anything against a Viltrumite, so they all fall. And yes, this includes Adam Eve, who would be killed by Mark, but then come back with her god powers, and even though she's able to land an incredibly powerful laser-like attack on him, it only leaves him injured, leaving Omni-Man the chance to come in and paralyze her. That way she can't do anything like that again. And yes, before I get any comments about it, Mark would be able to survive the same attack that Eve used on Conquest. The reason that he was able to survive isn't because of his strength, it's because of the way his body is made up, using smart atoms, something that even in that state, Adam Eve cannot easily manipulate. Using his resources and connections through Teen Team, Robot would try and create some sort of weapon to at least take down one of them. But sadly, no matter how hard he tries, there's nothing he can do. Even with his insane intellect, the best he's able to do is create a more gun-like version of the satellite blast that was able to give Nolan a nosebleed. But even when hitting him with it point blank, it does nothing. It scuffs him up a bit, but he's able to destroy it almost instantly after. They then spend the next few days tracking down Robot's still fleshy and wrinkly host body, and when they find it, it's almost like a mercy killing. Even this universe's version of Tech Jacket couldn't handle being double-teamed and is taken down in a matter of minutes. After every single hero, villain, and government is brought to its knees or killed, the Viltrumites would then begin their proper invasion. Nolan and Mark would be treated like kings because they were able to find a planet that contained life forms Viltrumites could successfully breed with. More so Nolan because he was the one given the mission to colonize this world, but Mark was looked on favorably too because he was the first example of a human and a Viltrumite breeding, and just how successful that process could be. In the coming centuries, the Viltrum Empire would be stronger than it ever was before, not only because of the increased ability that comes with hybrids, but also because their numbers are rising higher and higher. The coalition of planets would try and intervene, but not even the strongest version of Alan can take down at least 50 Viltrumites. Not to mention, if Alan comes to Earth in the same way he did in the original, he most likely would not survive his first encounter with Invincible, or in this timeline, Omni-Mark. And yes, this entire time I have been giving the backstory for one of the main Invincible variants we see in the war. I will do more original Invincible variant ideas in the future, but for right now I felt like this was a pretty good way to handle the first of the bunch. Omni-Mark is probably my favorite of the Invincible variants solely because of his design, but I also believe he's the most obvious shoo-in for got his powers early, or Debbie having died. To me, the former is the more likely outcome since I don't see Omni-Man still raising Mark if Debbie dies and he doesn't have his powers. And if Omni-Man doesn't raise him, then I don't see Mark looking up to his father in that same sort of way that would lead to him becoming Omni-Mark. The story of this Invincible variant is a tale of isolation, manipulation, and in its barest bones, control. With Mark unlocking these incredible abilities so early on in his life, Nolan would take the dominant role as his parental figure and basically shove Debbie to the sidelines. And if that happens, then Mark wouldn't have a chance at a normal childhood. Instead, he would be raised as a proper Viltrumite soldier, except to make him go along more willingly, it'd be disguised as teaching him how to be a hero. Then, Mark, who already idolized his father, would become far more stoic, serious, and in all ways cruel. That way he can properly embody the more honest image of his father that he has. And once we get to Season 4 and Omni-Mark's fate is revealed, you'll see that this tale does not have a happy ending. Moral of the story? Go watch Merge's video, linked in the top comment.